On discussing the perception of Asians, Hong used the word apparatchik, which I did not know when I looked up, and it was like an immediate kind of fist to the chest. And then I thought, I'm vlogging this, I should be vlogging this. I look up the page and I can't find it anywhere, so that is where my night is going. And I think that means I should probably leave this to another day. So it is incredible that I, when I finished reading, put in Goodreads, I'm 20 pages in, and then I opened it today and was like, I don't remember any of this. I'm on page 10, so you can tell how well I was doing yesterday. It is. I understand that she was struggling at that point in her life. It is a little bit hard to read, not because it's bad, but because there's a lot of like emotional resonance that I'm feeling with it. Like I mentioned, the being seen, being viewed as like an apparatchik. This idea of invisibility, being kind of looked over. Yeah. Which is not to say that it's all feeling. We are touching both on like her family history, of course, because it is memoir, and also a wee bit now into like the model minority and where that came from. Good afternoon. On my way to the library, and hopefully, as I said, we are going to be able to get an extension on Minor Feelings. It's been long enough. It's been long enough that I will need to restart. But there's like 4 days left on it, so I should be able to do it. So I get the anger, I get the paranoia and the gaslighting around racism, but there's just there's something about it that just doesn't sit right with me. And it didn't the first time either, but it's more egregious this time around. The thing that really stands out is this example talking about like the railroad being built and how bad it was for the coolies and the railroad workers, and then this comment about like a hypothetical girl who has been brought over, and it kind of reminded me about the criticism of Blonde, this idea that you can't fathom this kind of character that you've thought up. You can't fathom them as anything other than suffering, or rather that you can't conceive even like a moment of joy. And I don't know, like talking about paranoia in regards to racism, I don't know if I'm being paranoid, if I'm reading too much into it. That is the most egregious example, but there's like an undercurrent that I'm getting throughout the whole thing. And to be fair, I'm only on page like, I've only not long past page 20, so we're not far in, but so I think the boy from the nail salon is actually a better example, though I'd say a less egregious one. Talking about the railway is like talking about history and creating this like character, this female character who's like a spokesperson for all the Chinese women who were brought over to the country, whereas the anecdote with the boy is personal history, and she admits to having turned over the memory so often that she's basically rewritten it. So yeah, better example maybe. Sorry for the crackling, I can't fix it tonight. I rescind my criticism before. I think it was written from kind of the point that she was at her life, because in this bit, it's post-Trump election, and she's like justifiably worried about going to a state that was very pro-Trump. But also, it talks about meeting the people who live there, people who didn't vote that way, and it doesn't throw them under the bus, and I'm really glad for that. But it was just, I feel like because the first part was hard to read, that I maybe confused difficult with bad, and that is entirely on me. I really liked this bit, even though it felt like a therapy session. There was a really good bit about the kind of unfair and expectation of an instantaneous connection with someone, just because you're the same race. And what even is us, meaning Asian American? And it was really interesting. Yeah, big questions. And no. In reading reviews about the book before reading the book, there were comments like, it's a good book, but it's pretty 101. And I don't have the authority to agree or disagree with that. I have been feeling that way with it, but in defining minor feelings, a racialized range of emotions that are negative, dysphoric, and that kind of set off fireworks in my brain, calling it dysphoric. Yeah, I think, it goes on to like other, it's not dwelling on that word, but that is the one that's kind of lit up my brain. As a note, I finished one book for 25 at 25, and Minor Feelings has to go back today. So this is mostly the other ones. I have one book, I think, myself. So I'm going to just make a librarian's day hell, unfortunately. Morning. It has been a while, and in the interim, I have not done a lot of things. I did check out a prior video. Obviously, Cathy Park-Hong has read about Pryor's comedy and transcribed his work and all that, and so knows a lot more than I do. I I'm very interested in finding the pieces that she was talking about. Have not gotten to that yet though. I'm currently on the bit where she's talking about minor feelings, her definition of it, and I don't know if I've read this bit before, I might have. It is reminding me a lot of what I talked to my therapist about, in terms of like stillness on the surface, and not making waves, and just everything turbulent underneath. And it's very interesting coming to it from that. So I had read that chapter before. The end is no less devastating because of it. I want to point out this, though. The documentary that she mentions is free on YouTube to watch. The end of White Innocence is the most interesting part for me because of this bit, taken from Catherine Bond Stockton, about how the queer child grows sideways. that it's not, that you're not hitting the prescribed milestones of life, like marriage, kids, necessarily, and the way that it can also be about race, which is really interesting. And of course, Cathy Park Hong is talking about her growing up in America, and it's interesting because for me it's like, I'm Scottish, and it wasn't until last year that we had like a book on Southeast Asians in Britain. I think a collection of essays, and I don't remember what it was called, but like that was last year. And so for me growing up, I did grow up kind of identifying with white characters in a way that she couldn't, in a way that kind of fucked with my head. But then it was the immigrant story that I felt I should be hitting and couldn't. Yeah, it's a really interesting piece. A few years back, there was this really, really annoying kind of exchange about bad English on like Asian t-shirts and bad like Chinese characters, Japanese characters, on like Western, mostly white people, tattoos, and they were going on about it like, oh, this is like an equivalent thing, it's no big deal to laugh about. And it's like, you do realise why the incorrect tattoos like are generally incorrect, is because people just go on to like Google. They're not actually caring about the language, they just think it looks cool or it makes them seem worldly or whatever, that it is Orientalism. And I remember that people wanted clothes with like name tags or fashion brand tags that were in English. And like, that is not linguistic imperialism, although that absolutely is playing a role into why bad English is on t-shirts and things. And just like the idea that it could be equal is frustrating. Like, I think they're funny, I do, and I also find them compelling, in ways, because you can stumble onto like the example that Cathy Park Hong gives, that you can stumble onto like poetry with it, but the idea that it was equal was really annoying to me, and I'm glad that this is talking about bad English. Well, I also have a problem with bad English, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, just for clarification, because sleepy brain, I was talking about like someone not liking that their tag thing said made in China, and like someone else who's responding, well, at least it says made in China in English, like people can't tell, but that's what it says. The idea that made in China is lower class, lower quality kind of thing. Yeah. Also, another reason it annoys me is there was an example which was like, hi, I'm bubble tea, suck my boba, shall we say. And the idea that that's bad English is really, like, maybe they're doing it to be funny, but you can't conceptualize it as that. You just think it's bad. Like, you won't let the people of the language like have fun with English. You just think they're stupid. Much as I enjoyed an education, there really wasn't much I could do to talk about it. It was very personal, and I know that Minor Feelings is a memoir, but I didn't really know that until I picked it up, I think, or not long before that, because everyone was talking about it and the way that it talked about race, that it kind of felt more like one of those books than anything personal. Or I guess, yeah, yeah. Um, I really do like the idea of looking up all people that she's mentioned. It sounds like a fascinating breadth of work. And of course, then it went on to, I think, Portrait of an Artist, which is Teresa Hack Kyung Cha. And I was aware of this person, very drawn to the idea of reading dictee. Did not realise that she had died, and especially not in those circumstances. I'm Cathy Park Hong is talking about the silence around her death and how when something happens she sometimes looks away because she knows that it's not going to get coverage. And it reminded me a lot of what happened at the Lunar New Year and the shootings there. And author S. Choi Liu really saliently pointed out that he knew immediately because of where it was happening, because it wasn't a touristy spot, that it was an intra-community thing, and that coverage was going to dry up in days. And he was right. And I guess that's been spinning in the back of my head for a while, but I don't have anything to say now, and I didn't have anything to say then. It's just there, I guess, that this is just life and that it sucks. So I finished it. I found it compelling throughout, and it's not that the end, the last chapter, the last section is unsatisfying, but just that it is what it is. You know, just where we are in time and the world and the cultures. And because there is no, we talked about this with like Shang-Chi, that there is no pan-Asian unity in the way that there is for Black Panther. And that it was very kind of obviously going for that vibe. And yeah, whiteness doesn't need only white people to hold itself up anymore. And it's not like a story where you get a satisfying ending, and I know that, but it just, I guess it feels in this moment kind of like ending on helplessness. And I don't know with that. It doesn't feel like the place that I want to end this. So I will say, as to that last chapter, I did have a Hannah Lavery poem in the back of my mind as I read it, through parts of it, which is Scotland, You're Not Mine. And so I'm going to just end with that, I think. That it was going through my head, that it's an imperfect fit. But you should look up the poet